America, I'm Star Parker, and I wish I could bring you good news out of Washington, D.C., but I cannot. And I cannot because the Biden administration is insisting that they're going to weaponize race full force throughout this whole next year and a half, if they haven't done enough damage over the last 60 years since Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. They're going full force now to weaponize race so that they can divide this country and win an election. It is getting tiring. And I know that you as a believer, if you're a Christian like myself, we know that this is not what God had for us in this great country. That all men created equal is true. That he has given each and every one of us identity, purpose, meaning, hope, a future. But no, not according to the Biden administration, not according to a whole lot of left-wing liberals and progressives. They will constantly divide us. So what we've thought to do this week and for next week here on Cure America is to bring you some things from our archives on the topic of race. We're going to start with Dr. Bill Allen on the State of Black America, a tome of curepolicy.org. What Dr. Allen did was compiled thoughts from all types of leaders to bring us into the state of Black America. Now, one of the reasons you can't find it too many places, can't even find it on our site, is because when we brought out that tome, The State of Black America, what happened next? We heard from lawyers from the Urban League to tell us cease and desist using the very name, the State of Black America. All we want to do is show the pitfalls, the promises. We just want to let you know that there are two sides of this story, that you don't only have to hear from progressives when it comes to race matters. Over the last 60 years since Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech. Yep, this month is the anniversary of that speech. That's why I'm just so upset to a certain degree. Now we keep coming here. I mean, look what has just happened. Senator Tuberville in Alabama, all he's trying to do is say we shouldn't do abortion in the military. We should not have this in our defense bill. So now he's a racist. And you got the whole administration and even his own colleagues shying away from what he's trying to do because the left said, you're a racist. You can't say that. We need to kill Black babies. How dare you try to take abortion out of our military? No, Florida's now racist. Florida's racist. The governor there is a racist. Why? Because they really want to look at Black history. First state in the union to actually say, maybe we ought to look into Black history and see exactly what all of it is about. Let's do a curriculum. Now, all of a sudden, the curriculum is racist. Anyway, it was Dr. Bill Allen, who you're going to hear from here, because I'm going through the archives, who wrote the curriculum. He was one of the leaders on writing that curriculum. And it is not a racist curriculum. We've been through every part of it. It's not racist, but the left needs it to be racist. And they're going to use any and every one they can to distort the realities of what's in that real curriculum. Oh, who else is racist? Oh, the entire Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is racist because they decided that we shouldn't use race to decide who gets into college. That there are other attributes that we shouldn't, the whole DEI concept is inconsistent with our Constitution. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. This is what we were founded upon, but now we're racially divided. Now everything is racist that doesn't agree because now the Supreme Court, racist. Oh, Alabama itself is racist. Why? Because the court said, you know what? We're drawing these lines the way that you're doing is just not satisfactory and consistent to the Constitution. So all things are race-based. And the challenge that I have with this is over the next year and a half, we're going to hear from it. That's all we're going to hear. And it's not fair to those of us that really want to believe the Bible. It's really not fair to us that have diverse families, diverse communities, diverse friendships, that every single time we have difficult questions on the table, policy questions, cultural questions, even sometimes race questions, that it reduces down to America's evil. So we're going to, this week on Cure America, look at the tome with Dr. Allen. These are older interviews. You see different styles, but I want to bring them to you. So the first one you're going to look at is with Dr. Allen on the State of Black America. I've got an exciting show because you're going to see Jonathan here. You're going to see Ryan Bomberger here. You're going to see Raheem here, Raheem Williams, and after we get into Dr. Allen, I'll be right back to let you know who's up next.
Here's what federal spending of $900 billion annually has produced for Black America. Let's let these numbers sink in. Single-parent households have tripled since 1970. 75% of our Black children are in fatherless homes. That's right, 75%. 685,000 of our babies are aborted every year. 50% of black teenagers are unemployed. 43% of the prison population is black. The poverty rates among black has not changed in decades, but cities like Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, Baltimore, and many others are in ruins. Instead of helping, bad policies and billions of dollars have spread a sickness in our black communities. It's time for a cure. CURE is a coalition of new voices with new ideas that will become new policies. We are the CURE. The Center for Urban Renewal and Education, headquartered in Washington, D.C., CURE works with churches, political, and business leaders on behalf of urban communities. CURE's mission is to address issues of culture, race, and poverty from a Judeo-Christian perspective. CURE. Join with us.
Is our society spiraling out of control? Is it on the verge of collapse? That's going to be the question on the table here on Cure America this week. But before we get to some of that question, I have an incredibly special guest. I have an incredibly special guest and dear friend with a brand new project, Dr. William B. Allen.
Greetings, Star.
Greetings, oh my friend, and friend of some of yours. You've probably been saying, where is Dr. Allen? I'm still taking notes. I'm still reading my notes from when he was on, when you launched the show 2 years ago.
And let me, first of all, just congratulate you. 2 years establishing a solid presentation, which I know the country's grateful for, and I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. You've been a mentor of mine for, 30-something years now, and a resident scholar now at CURE, former COO of CURE, and that's why we moved from mom and pop to corporate. But you're also, and the reason I'm so blessed to have you on, you're the chairman, you were the former chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, emeritus Dean for James Madison College, emeritus professor of political science at Michigan State University. And the reason I'm giving you more of his resume is because he has a brand new tome out. Brand new, hot off the press, The State of Black America. The State of Black America for the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. Oh my goodness, this is our first as the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. You can find all details at curepolicy.org on this masterpiece. That is I think we could say that it is the alternative to what the left has narrated about Black America for the last 60 years.
That's a wonderful way to put it. It is an alternative, and it's not just an alternative in the sense of we're shouting back at them because they're shouting all the time. We're not shouting. You know, we spread a wide net. We solicited contributions from a broad range of people. We chose the best proposals that came in. Yeah. And there's a debate in this book. It's not just one side screaming. We have people who say we need more government support. We have people who say that's been the cause of the problem.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask you a few questions about this tome because I think that the contribution that you have made, that we now together are making for our society is really important one, especially in this time. Yes. So on the cover, it states that, in quote, in the 21st century, it is dangerous to ask the wrong questions about the state of Black America. Why dangerous? Why did you use that word?
It's dangerous because people are subject to bullying and intimidation. Every time they try to talk about this honestly, they're called racist.
Right.
Tell you a quick story. When I was leaving the Commission on Civil Rights as chair, I had a session with the Wednesday group on Capitol Hill. Those are the Republicans who get together every Wednesday in a study group. And I went through with them an update on the situation and told them how it needed to be talked about. Mm-hmm. To a person in that large group, these representatives, Congress people said to me, we can't do that. We'd be called racist.
We'd be called racist.
And it's only gotten worse in the 30 years since then.
Yeah. What is the fear? I mean, it's like one word scares people. Is it because of the history? In this tome, you go through the history. You and your other assayers talk about all of Black history. Yes. The good, the bad, the ugly, but also the beauty. So yes. Why is it that there's such a fear, even more embedded in the Republican Party than the other party, of just that one word?
Well, let me tell you something. You might not remember this in relation to this, but you will remember that before slavery ended, slavery couldn't be talked about in the United States. Mm. There was a gag rule in Congress when John Quincy Adams tried to talk about it. Yeah. People tried to shut it down.
That's true, that's true.
The same thing is happening here.
Right.
What does that tell us? That slavery was a cancer,
Right.
So severe, it had to be gotten rid of by surgery, radical surgery.
Ouch.
That's what the war was.
Yeah.
The new cancer is this narrative, this rhetoric of division
Right.
using race to divide people,
Right.
and therefore to make the country unable to come together as a whole. It is a cancer,
Right.
and part of having a cancer
Wait, what is the
shutting
cancer at this
down.
point? The cancer is the discussion?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, that rhetoric of
Rhetoric.
that wants to divide the country, that wants to foster sentiments of dependence and victimization on the one hand and guilt on the other, all to leverage for the sake of political power for some, the dishonest ones, and for the ones who are honest, and there are some honest ones,
Right.
it's because they hate America and want to destroy it.
Right. So then, can we conclude from that that the reason that fear is still in the psyche of many that, as you said, during slavery or previously to ending it, didn't want to talk about it and ended up in a civil war anyway?
Yes.
Is that the reason that they don't want to talk about it now? Because it might get so intense that we end up in war?
Well, that's part of it. That's part of the threat. That's part of the bullying and the intimidation. So that those who are silencing discussion
Right.
are the ones who are poisoning the culture.
Yes, they are. Boy, aren't they? On the same cover, then you also have a statement, in quotes, progress, pitfalls, and the promise of the republic, X quote. And you discuss in your essay the problem versus the promise of America. What is it that you're seeing?
Well, you know, when we sent out our solicitation, we asked people to respond with a broad range of topics. We said, talk to us about education, talk to us about economic development, talk to us about health, talk to us about welfare, talk to us about cultural development, talk to us about religion. And so what we got back was a really solid conversation about the real accomplishments post-slavery of American blacks. And they are real, they are substantial, they are important.
And they're proven. That's why I like that it's a tome. They're in there. You prove it. The data's there, all the research.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Okay, so
But
so
the
go ahead.
pitfalls were there too. But the first thing we demonstrate is that all those real accomplishments took place in the darkest days, when lynching was prevalent,
I know.
when enforced segregation was prevalent, still there was progress. I mean, we remind people, the Tulsa Massacre didn't massacre harmless people who couldn't take care of themselves.
Right.
They massacred successful entrepreneurs.
On all over the country. If they want to
Yes.
have a discussion about race and theory behind race dynamics, then perhaps they should remember this part of the history. I think that's what so disgusts me about the way that the left narrates on these questions.
Yes.
They just constantly pretend that it's all everyone was enslaved, and then there was no progress after slavery ended.
And you know why? Because it has been cultivated, it's been developed deliberately. There are many instances of, we mentioned them in the book,
Right.
but the one I will point out to you now, which is most dramatic in this sense, is Lyndon Johnson, 1965, saying to America and to American blacks in particular, equal opportunity is not enough.
Right.
Now, how does that translate?
Yeah.
That translates, you black people can't do it
Can't
for
do
yourself.
it. You don't know how to self-govern.
You can't do it.
There's something wrong with you. This is interesting because that is in that psyche. That is in that mentality. It was in the
Yes.
mentality even of the slave owners. Well, they wouldn't know how to live.
Yes.
And there are many blacks that said they would know how to live. Yes, just free them. Let them alone. You know, why would you even bring this into the new
they
union?
proved it, as you know, because
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells were pointing that out in 1893 already.
Put that out in here as well.
You know, they said, look,
Yeah.
you guys are keeping us out of the world's fair, but look, you're cheating yourselves.
Yeah.
Because we have shown in the 30 years since slavery ended the great accomplishments which are all attributable to the strength and resilience of America.
We don't have enough discussion on that, and so it's easy for many in other cultural ethnicities to look into black problem and think that it's all a problem and have pity. But you talk about the promise. Elaborate a little bit more about how their freedom allows for everyone to succeed, but in their gift, in their talent, in their space.
Yes, and we are really focused on one gift above all, and that's the gift of giving back, the gift of giving to the country, the gift of black patriotism that can save America. You know, our publisher Encounter published another book just before this, Jason Riley's book, Please Stop Helping Us.
We have that available too here.
And what I say to people is, consider this the sequel. The sequel says, let us help you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this is actually leads into my next question, because you write about the cultural approach of the current debate on these race matters, and you said the drive between the tensions is not about race, but about European culture. I mean, I got lost in that one. You talked about a modern state in contrast to constitutionalism. What were you saying?
You got to understand that you can't stop me from being a little philosophical.
Oh, I have over and over, and I'm like, okay, now I need my professor to come out and explain to me what you mean by this.
So I can explain that really very clearly. Before the nation state that everybody knows about came into being, talking about sovereignty, people were organized around tribes, or bloodlines, and religions. They weren't organized as nation states. The nation state meant we're no longer basing our lives culturally on tribes, blood, and religion. We're basing it on our political definitions.
Okay.
And so that means that developed in Europe, and it has become worldwide.
Okay.
So that's the European system.
So it developed in Europe, because we would still think that in Europe, and this is where I think I got lost, that they still basically are tribal, if we can use that. I mean, the Germans are still German, the Polish are still Polish.
But they're not organized politically that way.
Okay.
And they don't derive their authority from their ethnic heritage.
Okay, so that's the difference. Okay.
And so yes, so that started with the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. That was 1648. And it has dominated the world ever since.
All right.
And there are some people today, those who want to advocate socialism, who have become exhausted with that development and want to destroy it. That's what I mean when I say they want to destroy the European culture.
And that European culture is what we've termed here at Cura many a times is the principles of Christianity, it's the virtues of capitalism, it's a rule of law in the Constitution.
It is above all the self-government.
Self-government. So will this work? Can everyone self-govern?
Precisely. And in fact, that is
everyone,
the work.
Regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of what country they're born in, like humankind, did God gift us with the ability to self-govern?
Yes, and that's really the whole project of this book.
Wow.
People ask, what are you recommending? We recommend many things, but the first and most important thing we recommend is build confidence in self-government. Know that everybody's capable of it. Do that, and you begin to change the entire story.
Well, I only have a minute or two left with you because I need to pause you there. Not only do many believe that others don't have that ability, even here in our own country, even going back to what you're saying, people are afraid to even be called a racist. Some of it's because they can't go beyond the fact that they, in their deepest of heart, don't know if people can self-govern, that lived a history of slavery and Jim Crow. But the people themselves, there are a whole lot of African Americans in our country now that don't believe they have the ability to self-govern. They're disproportionate to depend on the nanny state. And you remember even when we ran our billboards, then we're looking right now at the second year of George Floyd, right when we launched this show, Cure America. The BLM forced those billboards down. They didn't want people to know that if they're tired of poverty, they have the ability to self-govern, to finish school, to get any job, to get married, to save and invest some money, and then they give back to their community.
Yes.
What do you say to that group? I'm going to leave the others who don't, who Frederick Douglass said, leave us alone, or Jason Riley said, just stop helping us. What do you want to tell them?
I want to tell them that they have been victimized, but not in the way they think. They've been injected with a poison, the poison of self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, lack of self-respect, because they have been told over and over again, and by people they thought were their leaders, that they couldn't do it. And now they've internalized that. And what has happened as a result? They've lost faith in America.
Yeah.
They express the lowest level of confidence in the United States.
I know I've seen the data where 40% say this is not my home. I'm like, Lord, help us.
That's what they say, Star, but notice, I keep reminding people, they're not crowding the exits.
They're not. We have to have another show on that. No one's leaving. Actually, they did try recent history, and we have a whole country in Africa still trying to become like America, but it's not working for them as much as they had probably originally thought. So you would then say to them, you do have that ability. You can self-govern. Get up, do it. Let's
not only can, but you have an obligation to do so.
No, tell
you
me
have an
about
obligation to God.
Wow.
Because this country is founded on the freedom of conscience, and the freedom of conscience means we have obligations to God before we have any obligations to society.
Wow.
God expects us to be self-governing, has ordained it for us, and has infused us with the Holy Spirit, with conscience.
That's right.
To make it possible.
Yeah. And when you have government chains about you, you're not going to be able to choose. And he wants us to choose.
Yes.
He wants us to choose good,
Yes.
but you have to have the ability to make those choices.
Exactly.
Dr. Allen, I've got to have you back on. I know you've got an amazing tour. I am so glad you stopped by Cure America first, as the book just came out, hot off the press. We must go to Cure Policy. I know, it's so good.
I want everybody to get it.
I can't. I mean, go to curepolicy.org, which is going to lead you to Encounter and/or where your favorite bookstores are, because it's a tome. It's our project, but it's not a nonprofit work, and we really, really need you to support this work and get that book and read it yourself. Let's make this discussion beyond what the headlines tell us in the little sound bites every time we have an incident across the country. Let's together cure our country. Dr. Allen, I can't thank you enough for all that you've done here for us here at Cure. So up next, you're going to hear from Ryan Bomberger, because Ryan weighed in during the whole BLM. So this is from 2020. Yeah, it's a little older. I was a little younger, but it's from 2020 when all this broke out. When we're looking at now a society that really began to break down again based on the BLM, based on George Floyd. I want you to hear Ryan's thoughts in this matter. I have a very, very unique program for you today here on Cure America. I'm Star Parker, and my exciting interview, someone I already know, but his work goes so far beyond what I know, which is my friendship with him and his wife, and they're just beautiful family. But I tell you, he wrote a stellar article this week speaking into the things that we're talking about here on Cure America with Star Parker. Part 2 of The Burden of Race and Rage. My very special interview guest today is Ryan Bomberger. Hey. Ryan, thank you. I have to say a little bit about you because they need to know more than just you're my friend.
Okay, just make sure you blow it up.
You're happily married to your best friend, Bethany,
yes.
Who's the executive director of Radiance. But Ryan Bomberger is the chief creative officer and co-founder of the Radiance Foundation, based near Washington, D.C. They're adoptive parents with 4 awesome kiddos. I think you wrote the word awesome before they had to homeschool them during COVID, even though they already homeschooled, but this was homeschooling on steroids, I understand. But Ryan also is an Emmy Award-winning creative professional, an international public speaker, and author of Not Equal, Civil Rights Gone Wrong. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
It's good for you to come. Thank you for doing it last minute, too.
Last minute.
Yeah.
Got to drive through Ghost Town, D.C.
I know.
Bizarre.
Well, you know what? That's why when the domestic terrorists came through and she gave them till 11 o'clock at night to do whatever it was they were supposed to do, we weren't even open. That's why a lot of us are very upset. We had not even moved into phase 1. So that's why it's a ghost town. It was a ghost town before they came through, and now it's a boarded uptown. But anyway, that is not what we're supposed to talk about. Oh, wait. Yes,
sort of, yes.
Yes, it is, because your article you published on blackcommunitynews.com today is so eye-opening to look into who we were dealing with on these streets and why we all locked ourselves in, and now the insurance companies told everybody board it up because we're not sure. We looked at their website, but you wrote an article. It's called 10 Top Reasons I Won't Support the Black Lives Matter movement. You went through them too. You said the premise is not true. There's no goal for forgiveness or reconciliation. It's all about Black power. They heavily promote homosexuality and transgenderism. They completely ignore fatherhood. They demand reparations. They want to abolish prisons and police forces. They are anti-capitalism. Colin Kaepernick supports them. Pro-abortion is proof that not all Black lives matter to them. I want you to go through them one by one, especially, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I'm thinking that if I be quiet, you will be able to explain. But you also have to tell us a little bit about your story. So let's get into both at the same time.
Okay.
Their premise is not true. You said that they use racism as a political weapon. Tell us what you know.
Well, the premise of the Black Lives Matter Foundation and the movement for Black Lives is that police brutality is epidemic. Black lives. We are endangered. You know, there's this epidemic of the killing of Black lives by police, and the numbers don't bear that out at all. In fact, you look at the numbers for 2020, you're looking at 2 Native Americans have been killed by police. There have been 9 Asians, you don't ever hear about them. The 46 Hispanics have been killed, 76 Blacks have been killed, 149 white individuals have been killed, okay? Wow. So you don't ever hear about anyone except for those of our complexion who are harmed or killed. Yeah. And out of all those who were killed by police, 90% of them were armed with a deadly weapon. So this year so far, only 9 of the 76 Black individuals who were killed were actually unarmed. armed. So the whole premise is untrue. And as we're seeing in Chicago, in the last 24 hours, 18 homicides, I am 11 times more likely to be killed by someone of my complexion than a white person. So this whole white supremacy premise isn't true. I'm not saying that white supremacy doesn't exist. I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist. But they're painting this picture of this victimhood and this violence, this epidemic of violence that is not happening.
Well, where I was really intrigued is when you said they're using it as a political weapon, because we know the politics of it, and you have been in the public sphere for a little bit of time now because of your pro-life positions and other places that you've seen the cultural war. But it must touch you personally as well. I mean, you're biracial. They want to have hearings on reparations, and I saw that was one of your places. What line would you even get in? Are you the one that will be
paying?
And
receiving. I guess it cancels itself out.
What's going on? I really also like point 2, no goal of forgiveness or reconciliation, because I've often said, you know, the issues of the past of America, that when we after our rebirth, after the Civil War, we were born again. But then we had to go through the Civil Rights Movement. But it seems that was settled in the Civil Rights Act. So something else has happened to where we constantly have to talk about racism as if it is institutionalized, as if it is systematic, as they're saying. So tell us a little bit about number 2.
Well, as a Christian, for me, I have to have a biblical worldview on things. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, and they have their own manifesto. People can see it at m4bl.org.
And there's you mentioned it in your article. I went and I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But go ahead, there's no mention
of forgiveness. There's no mention of reconciliation. So this is what ends up happening. Just like 6 years ago when Ferguson happened, we repeat the same thing. So we get back to the exact same starting point. So if there's no forgiveness, there's no reconciliation, there's no moving forward. And so as a Christian, I reject the worldview that, first of all, an entire people group can be blamed. Because that's basically, you know, Black Lives Matter movement is based on the critical race theory. There are 2 groups. You have the oppressed and the oppressors. And people of our complexion are always the oppressed. We're always the victims. And the oppressors are always white. And that's not helpful. You can't fight prejudice with more prejudice. You can't fight racism with more racism.
You know what intrigued me in doing a little bit more research after your column was that it is about ethnicity worldwide. They don't stop with just African Americans and the experiences here in this country. It is a them against us, and it seems like a war against the Western civilization. And why I would be concerned mostly about that premise is that this is where we get Christianity. So it seems like that ultimately they're against Christianity. But I want to talk about number 5. They completely ignore fatherhood.
Well, in order to promote homosexuality and transgenderism, they have to omit fathers. So they mention mothers, they mention villages, and they mention parents, but apparently fathers aren't part of the village. And we're seeing what's happening to the village. The village is in pain. And yet the reason for that, the largest contributing factor, is the absence of fathers. When fathers aren't in the home, you know, a child is 4 times more likely to grow up in poverty. When a father's not in the home, children are 2 times more likely to drop out of high school. Young girls are 2 times more likely to be obese. I mean, the list goes on and on of all, 7 times more likely to become pregnant. There are so many negative outcomes of the absence of a father, yet they don't mention fathers at all. And so as a father of 4, as someone who had a great role model for a father, children need a mother and a father. I understand there are circumstances where that doesn't happen. I know a lot of single moms do all they can to, I mean, your story obviously exemplifies that, but we can't ignore the reality that fathers are needed.
Here's what federal spending of $900 billion annually has produced for Black America. Let's let these numbers sink in. Single-parent households have tripled since 1970. 75% of our Black children are in fatherless homes. That's right, 75%. 685,000 of our babies are aborted every year. 50% of Black teenagers are unemployed. 43% of the prison population is Black. The poverty rates among Black has not changed in decades, but cities like Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, Baltimore, and many others are in ruins. Instead of helping, bad policies and billions of dollars have spread a sickness in our Black communities. It's time for a cure. CURE is a coalition of new voices with new ideas that will become new policies. We are the CURE. The Center for Urban Renewal and Education, headquartered in Washington, D.C., CURE works with churches, political, and business leaders on behalf of urban communities. CURE's mission is to address issues of culture, race, and poverty from a Judeo-Christian perspective. CURE. Join with us.
You might be thinking by now, well, then what should we do, Star? I mean, race is in our psyche. We do understand that we have situations to where the past does come into the future. We still have breakdown in a variety of areas, whether it's educational areas, poverty areas. What do we need to be thinking about? So up next, you'll hear from Jonathan Alexandre. Jonathan is going to interview about Frederick Douglass. This is from Black History Month earlier this year. And I think that you'll appreciate some of that conversation.
And it's February, so it's African American History Month, and we get this opportunity every year really to pause and think about the African American story and how it involves the greater American story, how it influences the greater American story. We can think of the trials and the triumphs of the African American here in this country. The African American strong commitment and courageous persistence, its faith, the way he was able to overcome in moments of great adversary, moments of great difficulty. And we really want to analyze what the African American story was, because there's so much now coming around it, attempting to dictate, well, this is what the African American story means for America. This is how we have to rewrite history in order to understand where we go from here. You know, we're sitting in the shadow of the US Capitol, where almost every session, 3,900 bills are introduced that either mention race or underrepresentation or minority, all ways of the federal government attempting to influence what the African American story is and throwing money at it. You know, is that the right approach? Is that the direction that we ought to be going in, a consistent intervention of federal government in dictating what the African American story is? Well, I don't think so. And as we go on through the show, we'll unpack that a bit. But for us to really delve into that story is with us a research fellow from Heritage Foundation, Delano Squires. Delano, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to look at the African American story via one particular lens, and it's the lens of Frederick Douglass. He was an abolitionist, an orator, a man who stands above other men in many regards in his oratory skills and his ability to compel the nation morally to do what's right towards African American. He had a different approach than the tenor that we're hearing now. Tell us a bit about Frederick Douglass and why his story is so significant in writing the story of the African American.
Well, yeah, I think Frederick Douglass is the quintessential American. I think a man born into slavery, who worked tirelessly for the cause of liberty, to make us a more perfect union. But he did it, again, in ways that were distinctly American. He was rooted in a particular faith perspective, right? So he would quote the scripture. He talked about the fact that we are all created by God. Right. We have inalienable rights. And one of the things that struck me reading a lot of his writings, and one of the things that I'm sure you know, is that oftentimes there are people, particularly on the left, who they only quote Douglass on the 4th of July. Right. When they want to read a portion of, you know, what to the slave is the 4th of July. But I like reading Frederick Douglass's work, particularly around the cause of abolition. And in one of his speeches, I think he gave in Rochester, he said, you know, people would often ask me, what shall we do with the enslaved if emancipated? And I'm paraphrasing, but his short answer was, do nothing with us. Wow. Your doing to this point has caused us much harm. And he said something to the effect of, you know, if the apples will not stay on the tree of their own accord, then let them fall. And his point was, even at that point in our history, enslaved Americans at that point deserved the chance to rise or fall on their own merit.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. What you're hearing all over the country, and you've heard this narrative for the past, if not 15 years, maybe a little longer, that there's a requirement of federal government, certainly a requirement of local mayors and government to dictate what goes on. And it's in so many different areas of life, whether it's, you know, credit or housing or healthcare, or, you know, there's even a law proposed that says concealed carry is inherently racist. There's always this approach to the African American saying, government, we're going to intervene in your story. But here's Frederick Douglass saying, leave them alone, let them either rise or fall on their own?
Yeah, and I think he understood that even though obviously slavery was struck at the heart of human dignity, that Black Americans at that point still had that dignity. They still had a desire to work for themselves, to rebuild their families. And what you see, obviously, after emancipation, there were people whose families had been sold into other states who took out ads in newspapers, letters to the editor that said, "I'm looking for my wife and my 3 kids." So at that point in history, Black people were trying to do for themselves, to find family, to build lives, in dignity and in honor, to work for themselves. And I think Douglass was the type of person that I think anyone, whether on the left or the right, should look to for inspiration, even as it relates to right now, and particularly when you juxtapose his message against that of someone, for instance, like Ibram Kendi, who says, every social or economic disparity that you find in society is caused by racist policy. And his solutions for what ails Black America are always one of 2 things: bigger government or better white people. And Frederick Douglass was not that kind of guy.
Contrast, you said Ibrahim X, so he has an approach, and I think it is probably the prevailing thought amongst, if not young Black American thinkers, but also what's being taught in the universities, that there is a consistent wrongdoing that has been perpetuated by whites, one race, or by the systems, as it were, the entirety of the system. The only way to fix that is by either changing their hearts or government forcing that change, forcing that intervention.
Yeah.
But you're saying Frederick Douglass contrasted that in the way that he approached.
Yeah.
How do we, in engaging with policy, how do we read some of these laws and interpret, well, this is a direction that maybe the federal government may be able to speak to versus this is something that is totally up to the family, totally up to the individual. How do we discern in certain policies if this is taking the Ibrahim X track or if this is taking the Frederick Douglass track?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think the first thing we should acknowledge is that the government does not have the ability to ensure all people end up in the same place.
I think that's worth noting. So the government can't create this fictitious equity.
Correct.
Is the word that they
not the way they define it.
Not the way they.
Now I take a biblical definition of equity, right? Okay. So the impartial application of a particular rule or standard. That to me is equity. It's about impartiality. But when the government says equity, they mean partiality. That means, okay, there are too many of this group here and too few of this group, so we want to move the dials around so that we get equal representation. And I think it's a damaging frame. I'll just give you one quick example. When my wife and I we were living in DC, we were looking for a preschool for our daughter because preschool starts at 3 years old, and a lot of parents are looking for relief from daycare. We went to a Montessori school, and we thought she would do well in this type of environment. She's very smart, very bright, self-directed. And what we found is that this Montessori school actually found a way to address the achievement gap that people talk about between white students and Black students. And it had relatively equal numbers of both. For context, the reading proficiency in DC, let's say it's about 35%. Let's say something similar for math.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly as a parenthesis, you see a huge number of these bills try to address the educational disparity, throwing money schools at Baltimore, all over the country, but those still exist. And so Montessori schools, private schools, different approach. But
and this was a public charter Montessori school. For white students in DC, just given DC's demographic profile, those reading and math scores are up in the 70 percentile, right? This Montessori school, as I said, solve the achievement gap. The way they did that was to get all of the students to perform equally poorly. So the Black and the white and the Asian and the Hispanic kids were all around 35%.
So lowering expectations, an outcome of lowering expectations, and you're saying that's what equity or a government approach to equity, a non-biblical government approach to equity, ultimately
that is what it produces. There's no way to ensure that all the trees in the forest grow at the same grow to the same height unless you cut the tops off of some.
And it's so critically important for us to, and I think it really is unmissed. It's really missed by many individuals. When you talk about equity, it's first often material equality. So basic socialism, communistic approach. You know, this neighbor has more than this, therefore something must be wrong. It does not talk about the individuality or the hard work or you know, capitalism or, you know, the Protestant work ethic. It has no equation for all that. It's automatically something must be wrong. At the same time, there are individuals who say, well, of course it would be wrong. You know, these two groups, if you would only separate between black and white, had different origins, different starts to this country. Frederick Douglass doesn't ignore those realities. He doesn't ignore the station in which he was born, but there's something that he still calls individuals to a higher moral purpose than that. And as you said, it's purely American. It's something that lasts regardless of which race and lasts the history of our entire country. Talk more a bit about that, him calling everyone to task regardless of what race they came in, because he even had to challenge his African-American counterparts and say, you know, this isn't necessarily the approach that we need.
I think part of it is he understood, you know, the nature of humanity, and he wanted to treat men as men. He didn't believe in infantilizing, you know, black people. To your point, he didn't wipe away their history to that point. He just understood that the only way forward was forward, and it would have to be sort of expressed through a rugged, you know, I don't even rugged manhood, more generally speaking, not through paternalism. He talked about justice, and he said what whites were giving blacks to that point was charity. Right? It wasn't justice. It wasn't equal, you know, treatment, same standards, so on and so forth. So his thing was, don't patronize me, right? You're not my dad, but it's also don't punish me. So same standards for all people, and I think there are parallels between how slave owners thought about their slaves, particularly blacks, in terms of our inability to reason, right? They dehumanized us in not believing that we were able to do the same things that they could do.
I think it's such an excellent point. In Jamaica, you and I both come from Caribbean countries. Jamaica, when they first had sort of emancipation for the slaves, they had a code where they'd put in this dictating from government, telling African Americans or Jamaican Americans, African Jamaicans, look individuals in the eye when you speak to them. Make sure you're standing upright. I mean, codes from the government saying, well, you don't know this slave other than us in a paternalistic fashion, teaching it to you. And Frederick Douglass, you're saying, realize that this is always going to be the trend if I don't speak to it. And you're saying that some of the same symptoms we're seeing today, that if we don't tip the scales in favor of the African American, if we don't push them forward and place them in situations they otherwise don't have the capability of getting them there themselves. And you're saying that's ultimately not a good thing.
It's not a good thing. And what the slave owner thought is that the Negro was motivated by blood and genes, right? There was one man, Samuel Cartwright, who came up with the term drapetomania, which was a mental condition that that expressed itself in a desire for slaves to be free, right? So they believed in racial pseudoscience in the same way someone like Robin DiAngelo believes in racial pseudoscience, but
or even Margaret Sanger, and we've seen that in the abortion
or Margaret Sanger, but to much of the left today, black folk are just as, you know, devoid of agency as we were 200 years ago. So now, and I. Prior to coming to Heritage, I worked in local government for over a decade. My last year was in the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, so I'm very familiar in that space.
With about 30 seconds left, just to continue that thought, what were some of the outcomes that you saw there, and what would be sort of a big picture outcome in engaging with the African American and their approach to race here in government?
So some of the outcomes were, one I'll say is this: there's no disparity in our society that is more glaring than who ends up being victims of violent crime in large cities. 90+% of the people who were shot and killed in this city were young black men. And the other thing that I found is that when people responded to that issue, it was always systemic factors that they went to first. Never about the moral agency of the person who picks up the gun and decides to handle a dispute by shooting somebody.
Delano, thank you of course, as we're realizing, this conversation should go on much longer
Yes.
than the small segment. And I do appreciate you being on the show.
Our own senior policy analyst, Raheem Williams, did a study on the weaponization of race. It's on our website, curepolicy.org, but right now you're going to hear from an interview that I did with him on that particular study and the release of that study. I have another guest for you. Actually, some of you know Raheem Williams because he's been on before. But before I get into the interview with him, I want to just thank you. We have now picked up 5 networks. You're one of 5. Well, if you're one, then you're one of 4 others. Networks that are now carrying Cure America with Star Park. And we want to thank you because we are just like growing and growing and want to grow more. So if you have a friend that's not picking it up, have them go to curepolicy.org and we'll drop it in their box, their email, on Mondays, or wherever you're seeing it, if you're on one of our networks, whether it's TCT or NRB or now Jack Hibb, everywhere we're being carried, you might want to just refer them there. But of course, we would love them on our website, curepolicy.org, on our list so that they will then get the reports that we're getting ready to talk about. They're on the website, but they will get them in their inbox, and you can get it in your inbox too if you sign up at curepolicy.org. We'll send it to you. And we're not going to send you all kind of other junk. We don't sell our list. We're not doing any of that kind of stuff. We'd rather slowly grow, and your gifts will help us grow, but we'd rather slowly grow than to just start sending a lot of junk mail. So Raheem Williams, he's policy analyst here at Cure, and he's going to tell us a little bit about this weaponization of race, how it hurts America. It's a new report. You and Marty have signed off on. Myself, I'm on this report, but it addresses basically a lot of the challenges that we've seen race in America, and I think that we're going to get into a whole lot of questions and go deeply diving into this report in August on the anniversary of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, because you heavily point to that. But welcome to Cure America again.
It's a pleasure to be here, Star. You know, I always love coming to work, working with you, working with our team, and it's absolutely amazing to see how well the show's doing.
Yeah, it is good, huh? And I'm telling you, the office, I walk in and you guys are just chatting it up, and I'm thinking, wait, why are they not all like that?
We work sometimes.
We're thinking. They're thinking. So you guys have been thinking about this weaponization of race and how it hurts America. We're getting out of Black History Month. A lot of discussion on race, but it still seems we're so divided as a country. Is this because we focus too much on race?
I would say there are people who find it politically advantageous to weaponize our racial differences, and our report really covers how that's kind of evolved in the later half. You had kind of these beautiful moments that seem like racial reconciliation was possible, and that kind of starts with Dr. King's speech. And there was even a brief moment during the after the Obama election where people thought that would happen. But what our report details is how those moments became fleeting and why they didn't actually kind of materialize into a post-racial society. And a lot of that is because there are people who purposely inflame race. And you probably experienced it as a Black conservative. And we kind of talk about how Cori Bush attacked Brian Donalds for no reason, basically calling him a prop and more or less words a token for essentially believing in things like, I don't know, like aborting massive amounts of Black babies is wrong.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's
all
apparent.
of a sudden, you're sold out to the race. But you know, it's interesting though, Raheem, because majority of Black Christians agree with the conservative right on these issues that you're pointing out in this particular report. Why aren't we seeing more expressions, even in the internet, where people can be a little bit anonymous to say, come on, stop using us as your excuse to further an agenda that's inconsistent with the country?
Well, I don't want to give away too much of the report, but I think that's kind of the value of this report is it does kind of expose their methodology of the sorts, right? And it doesn't always go, how do you say this, at a textbook. There aren't always riots. One of the cases in the report points out the South Carolina case. You had the shooting of Michael Scott, and you also had that gruesome church shooting in Charleston. And what you saw was Nikki Haley much to her credit, then governor, was able to reach across the aisles, bring the community together, and they rejected outside agitators, and they said, you know what, hate will not live here.
Wow.
They brought down that Confederate flag, and Democrats and Republicans came together, and they said, you know what, this is not what we want to be about. And that's what we have to start, that's how we have to respond to these agitators. Because, again,
more people need to respond, and I think that more African Americans need to respond with the white Americans that are saying, come on, enough of this. We've done everything. Let's become e pluribus unum, which I'm going to talk to our panel about a little bit, because I want you to get into dispelling 3 common myths on black advancement, because I think that this is one of the reasons we still have such tension. These myths are out there, and they live large in black communities and black circles, even in black churches, to where we're taught fear first. Even above our own faith, we're told to put your fear above your faith, to put your color before your Christ, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get into some of these myths that you pointed out, if you will. The first myth, you say, now this is another study, right? This is up on the website too? Yes. Can they find this on the website? Okay, so the Dispelling 3 Common Myths on Black Advancement. This is Raheem's work here at CURE as policy analyst. And he has a long resume of policy analyzing, so I hope that they're putting it in a Chiron, or you'll see his bio up on our website. But the first one you say is the racial political representation improves black condition. I don't know why I'm
so the first myth.
So tell us this.
The first myth is this idea that if you elect more people that look like you, reflect your race, right, then your condition will improve dramatically. So, one, I want to be very clear, there's nothing wrong with voting for black people. I mean, there are black candidates that are very good and qualified at what they do. And when politicians of any color get results, positive results and outcomes for their constituents, they should be reelected. Right. So we argue for a merit-based approach. It's like, exactly what have you done for our communities? How are you advancing our communities? That's what we at CURE believe the conversation should be about, more so than white versus black. We don't look at the word.
Because these are gerrymandered districts, and 100% of those that have the majority blacks in their districts are sent back to Washington, and it is a legitimate question to say, okay, being black doesn't seem to be working for the community because matters are getting worse.
So what I took a look at was what happened with the racial wealth gap. So using some MBRE data, I was able to recreate a graph that showed the racial wealth gap in the election of black representatives in Congress. And what you notice is the time immediately following the Civil War, after slavery ended, the gap started to close very fast. And the reason that is because we were starting off with nothing. So coming from nothing to something, you're going to see that. But around 1965, it starts to slow. And that's actually very interesting, because that's an era that's kind of denoted, for the Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Movement, and kind of this great racial reckoning. And then even something more peculiar, since the 90s, it's actually gotten worse.
Right.
And in this time, you've seen the amount of black elected officials skyrocket. They went from 2 to 3 in Congress to, I believe, around 53 today. And more so, and we only have limited data to go by this, around 2000 around 2000 and the 2010s, you see the number of elected black officials in this country on every level, from city council to state legislature, attorney general's office, every level of government, go from about 1,800 in the 1970s to over 10,000.
Oh, wow.
And as this is happening, we see the black-white wealth gap essentially either stagnate or get worse. So I'm not trying to blame those representatives, right? You can't put that blanket on everybody.
But
everybody
you can legitimately ask the question, well, being black alone is not the answer. Maybe we should be looking elsewhere as we keep having these racial discussions as if that is the answer.
You have to look at platforms carefully, and you can't just assume. And, our progressive friends love to say it, and I'll say it too. All skin folk ain't kinfolk. So it's really just that simple. It's like, just the assumption here is that a black politician is better than a white politician just isn't true, or an Asian politician or a female politician. That's not how this works.
Well, you can see that fall apart with them when they just say, but a black conservative doesn't qualify either.
Of course, right? They always have those qualifiers.
So this is really interesting, but I don't want to run out of time to get into myth 2, because this study is on our website as well, so people can look through all of the details of it. But the second one you say is reparations. You're talking about reparations. You said are a feasible solution to black equality concerns. Oh, equity concerns. I'm sorry, I can't read with my glasses. Okay, so you say reparations continue to be a hot topic in the debate over racial equity. Talk to us about that a little bit.
So what you see with reparations is kind of like this carrot that gets dangled out there, right? Every few years a bill gets introduced. Conveniently, when Democrats aren't in power, they like to throw the bill out there.
Right, and that's true.
So there's a big issue. I believe Sandy Durst, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, he's a black economist at Stanford. He estimated the cost to be $14 trillion. It's about 50% of US GDP, so that's astronomical. It will be the largest expense ever seen. How does he suppose we pay for it? He has no idea.
Okay. How does he suppose that we decide who gets in the line for the reparation?
That's also very much unclear because a lot of black people who are descendants of slaves, guess what? Record keeping in 1839 isn't as great as it is today.
That's right.
So a lot of people who actually would be in theory entitled to the money wouldn't get it. And then you also have the issue of, well, who's going to pay? Are you asking people who have never owned slaves? Maybe even come from families that never owned slaves, that immigrated in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, or even more recently, to pay for sins that they had nothing to do with. And is that actually fair?
Yeah, we had a discussion about that here in the office because, there are now localities that are saying we have to do what they're calling reparations. And Marty brought up a really interesting point that there's a difference between reparations and restitution. If someone has erred against you, and according to Scripture, you do go to them and you do repay. You repair. So that's an interesting point you're making. Those that had nothing to do with that sin, but where you do have a person who says, I can prove to the court of law that this was done to me, that would be considered restitution, not a reparation. And I think that liberals are often just mixing words and meanings of words to get people confused.
And you're absolutely right, because when you look at it from a restitution standpoint, there's a lot of people who would be left out of this payment plan, right?
That's exactly right.
Ileana Omar, she's first generation American, straight from Africa. She's an immigrant, nothing wrong with that, but her ancestors were not slaves in America.
Right.
Barack Obama, similar story. So it's kind of like these people, the first black president wouldn't qualify.
Wow.
So think about that for a second. And not only that, is more nuanced because there are people who more or less look white, present as white people that do have slavery ancestry. So you have these cases where they didn't even know.
Did you just see that? Angela Davis's relatives were on the Mayflower. They just discovered that Henry Louis Gates. They did that whole research into her.
Exactly.
For her, she joined the Communist Party for nothing. Okay. We only have one little minute to get through the third one. Diversity programs help elevate people of color. You said that this is a myth.
Well, so it creates a stigma, right? Nobody wants to believe the person that their manager or their coworker is being elevated for arbitrary reasons. Everybody wants to think their work is valued independently and for what it's worth. We like merit. We like to know that people who work hard earn things. And when you add race, when you add gender, when you add sexuality, and you say, hey, these are defining characteristics that are important to us, it makes other people feel resentful naturally because it's like, wait, hold on, I'm not gay, but I do really good work here. Why doesn't that matter? This is a corporation. This is a firm. This is an organization. Why isn't my work product what I'm being judged off of? Wow. It demeans black people and it creates resentment. So you see a Harvard economist did a huge study. He looked at 465 firms that had these diversity programs, and they actually found out that black people were less likely to get promoted in these firms because it created that resentment that otherwise wouldn't have been there. Before, you just assume people are being promoted in advance because they're good at their jobs. But you add this dynamic and it creates confusion that doesn't need to be there.
That's interesting because that's the original point that Clarence Thomas was making when he objected to affirmative action programs, which then caught up with him during his confirmation hearings. And all he was saying is, I want to be judged by merit, and I think all other African Americans should want the same. Thanks, Raheem. He does great work for here at CURE, and I'm so happy that he does a report a month almost now. So a whole lot more work. So you can see that at curepolicy.org. In conclusion, where do we go from here? Well, we know what the Scripture says. The conclusion of the matter is fear God, keep His commandments. That's man's all. He did ask us to love one another. And this is individualism. This has nothing to do with government, as you heard throughout this show today. This is not something government can do, should do, and we really need to take on ourselves the responsibility to do. Just love your neighbor as yourself. It really just comes down to that.